But for you and I, who are equipping ourselves while building our own faith, how to help others, this video captures our full attention, and I hope that you appreciate what you should never take for granted. Lesson number 11, the historicity of Christ.
Did Jesus Christ ever really live? That's a question that many are wondering, many are asking. Have you ever wondered if you can prove that Jesus Christ was a historical person? There are some today who would tell us that we cannot prove that Jesus Christ was a historical person. There are some who would tell us that there is not enough proof to even put Jesus on the earth. We're not even sure He ever lived here. He could be just a legendary, mythical figment of the Christian's imagination. Just this week, I received an email from a person who suggested to us that Jesus never lived. In fact, he said in a very belligerent way, he said there is no proof for Jesus' life. Let me read you just a few little excerpts from that email that he sent. We'll call him Jay. Jay said, "The real truth is, you or no one else can prove there ever was a Jesus as described in the New Testament. All you have is blind faith and zero proof. Blind faith has made Christianity believe the Jesus nonsense. There is zero proof of a historical Jesus. Why keep lying that there is?" Jay would say that there is no proof that Jesus ever even lived, and that we should just stop lying like we have proof for that. Other people agree with what Jay has said. In about 1970, a man by the name of John Allegro wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom. In that book, he suggested that Jesus never really lived probably, and that His life was a figment of the Christian imagination. In 1992, a man by the name of Dan Barker, a denominational preacher turned atheist, wrote a book called Losing Faith in Faith. And in that book, Dan Barker said this. He said, "The gospel stories are no more historic than the Genesis creation accounts are scientific. It is rational to conclude that the New Testament Jesus is a myth." Dan Barker would say that Jesus is a myth. A lady by the name of Judith Hayes wrote a book, In God We Trust, But Which One? And in that particular book, she made the following statement. She said, "Just whether or not Jesus was an actual historical figure is the subject of much scholarly debate. He may have existed, and then again, He may not have." Is it the case that there's not enough evidence to prove that Jesus Christ existed? In an email, I have a man who says that there's not enough proof. In several books, Dan Barker, Judith Hayes, John Allegro, they say, well, there's not enough proof. There is a website that is for a movie called The Beast. And this movie is supposed to suggest to us that there never was a Jesus Christ. Let me read to you just a little bit of the section from the website of this particular movie, and I think you'll see that whoever is writing this movie would tell us that Jesus never lived. Let me read to you a section, a trailer for the movie called The Beast. When her father, a biblical scholar, mysteriously disappears, a Christian high school student named Danielle investigates. She discovers that he had stumbled across a cover-up of Christianity's best-kept secret, that Jesus Christ never existed. Now that she possesses proof of this dangerous fact, Danielle must confront two strong forces: a band of fundamentalist Christians who will stop at nothing to suppress the truth, and her own desire for Jesus Christ to be real. Diving into factual territory, well explored by scholars, but largely hidden from the view of the public, The Beast is an epic story of innocence lost, faith in crisis, and the astonishing power of the truth to survive. This movie would suggest that Danielle fell upon a secret that was Christianity's best kept secret, that Jesus never existed. Is that true? Is it true that there's not enough evidence to prove that Jesus really existed? I'm here today to tell you that that is not true, that is the furthest thing from the truth. Look what people like those who are writing the movie The Beast are trying to suggest. That scholars have delved into this information, and it's well explored by scholars. But the public just doesn't know all of this information that we know, we scholars know, according to these writers. And if the public knew that, they might well understand that Jesus never really existed. Is that true? Is it true that the scholars don't accept the life of Jesus, but the uninformed public, that's why they accept it, because they don't have the information of the scholars? No, that is not true. Any honest scholar who deals with the facts of the matter is forced to come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ really lived. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to be the jury in a case. We're going to try, as we would in a court of law, the question, did Jesus really live? Can we prove that Jesus was a person? I'm going to ask you to suspend your judgment and to watch this court case as if you were a jury watching a trial. And I'm going to call to the witness stand several witnesses. And these witnesses are going to testify about the life of Jesus. At the end of this trial, we're going to ask you to pass a verdict. Yes, Jesus Christ was a historical person. No, Jesus Christ was not a historical person, based on the evidence that you see. The first group of people I would like to call to the stand are the New Testament writers. You well know the New Testament writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and we have Paul and Peter, and you know the New Testament writers. They wrote the 27 books of the New Testament. Those 27 books were written between about the years 50 AD to 100 AD. These books are the most historically accurate ancient documents that have ever been uncovered. Every single time these books make a statement, if you can check the statement, it always proves to be exactly right. So if we were to call these witnesses to the stand and we started asking them questions, every time we ask them a question, their statement would be 100% totally accurate. When they made statements about geographical positions, 100% totally accurate. When they made statements about who was in charge of the government during their time, 100% totally accurate. Statements about what cities were in what places or what islands were where, they're always right. If we ask them, did Jesus Christ live? Their overwhelming answer, a resounding yes. Not only did he just live, but he was born in Bethlehem. He walked the streets of Judea. He was crucified outside the city of Jerusalem. Facts over and above all of the idea that he just lived. Specific details of his mother's name, his brother's names, go down the list. If you were to ask these witnesses, did Jesus Christ live? They, with one voice, say yes. Are you sure Jesus lived? Listen to Peter. Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 says, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty." Peter, you are on the witness stand. Did you see Jesus? Yes, I was an eyewitness. John, in 1 John chapter 1 says, "The things which we have seen, the things which we have looked upon, the things which our hands have handled concerning the word of life." John, did you see Jesus? Yes. Did you look upon Him with your eyes? Yes. In the book of Acts and in Luke, the writer Luke explains that he is talking to Theophilus about these things with infallible proofs, about the things which are most certainly believed among us. When Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talked about the people who had seen Jesus, he said he was seen by Cephas and then by the 12 and then by over 500 brethren. The people who wrote the New Testament documents claimed to see, eyewitness, Jesus living on this earth. Well, what would the skeptic do with that? Well, the skeptic would have a very hard time, because these men who wrote the 27 books of the New Testament, every single statement they ever made was 100% accurate if you can check it, and they said Jesus lived. Well, how do the New Testament documents compare to other documents? When we look at the other ancient documents, for instance, Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad was written supposedly in about 700 BC. We don't know when the first manuscript was discovered. We've got about 643 manuscripts of Homer's Iliad. The history of Herodotus? The history of Herodotus was written in about 425 BC. The first one that was ever found was found in about 900 AD, and we have about 8 manuscripts of the history of Herodotus. Josephus's Jewish Wars, written in about 100 AD. We found the first manuscript in about 400 AD. There are about 9 manuscripts of Josephus's Wars. Tacitus wrote a book called The Histories, in which he put things that happened in about 100 AD and before. The first manuscript that we have of that is about 900 AD. The New Testament documents were written from about 50 AD to 100 AD. The first manuscript we found is in 125, the John Rylands manuscript, the section of it, only separated by 25 years or so from the time that the New Testament books were written, and we found 5,700 and somewhere around 35 manuscripts of the New Testament documents. If you were to ask any honest historian, what is the most historically accurate, well-documented set of books in the world, every historian would have to admit the New Testament documents. Now, suppose I stand up here and I quote to you 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21. There's also an antitype which now saves us, namely baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Suppose I quote that. What does that mean about 1 Peter 3:21? Well, kind of a vague question, but it means that 1 Peter 3:21 was written before I quoted that scripture to you, doesn't it? Well, we have several early preachers, non-inspired preachers, who quoted the New Testament documents extensively. In fact, scholars suggest to us that they quoted them so extensively that if we didn't have a single manuscript of the New Testament, the quotes from these early church preachers, also sometimes called early church fathers, the quotes would be enough to give us the entire text of the New Testament. Let me go through some of those with you. Look at some of these early preachers. We have Clement of Rome, who lived from about AD 30 to 100. Ignatius, who lived from about AD 70 to 110. Polycarp, from about AD 70 to 156. Justin Martyr, 100 to 165 AD. Irenaeus, 130 to 202 AD. These men quoted the New Testament scriptures, so you know that the scriptures had to be written before they quoted them. Another interesting point here. The skeptic often says, well, there are contradictions in the biblical text. Matthew contradicts Mark, and Mark contradicts Luke. Now, we've dealt with that. But in that accusation, the skeptic is admitting that those books did not copy one another, that those writers are different, independent writers and witnesses of the ideas that are written in those books. So if we have independent witnesses, we're not calling one book the Bible. We're calling Matthew by himself, he testifies. Mark by himself, he testifies. Peter by himself, he testifies. John, Luke, go down the list. They're testifying individually. So you're not having one witness come here. You're having an abundance of New Testament witnesses stand before you and all admit that Jesus Christ was a real person. Let's call someone else to the stand. A man by the name of Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish writer who recorded Jewish history. 2 times in Josephus's writings, he documented the life of Jesus Christ. Look with me at a statement that Josephus made in his book Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, chapter 9, verse 1. Ananus brought before the Sanhedrin a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and condemned them to be stoned to death. Do you see what Josephus says here? He says there was a man named James who had a brother named Jesus, and this Jesus was called the Christ. Our New Testament documents have for us references to Jesus' brother James. Maybe you'll recall the book of James in the New Testament was written by not John's brother, because he had been killed in Acts there about chapter 11 or 12. Herod had killed him with the sword. The James that wrote the book of James is most likely James, the Lord's brother. Documented by Josephus, James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. But Josephus also had something else to say about Jesus. Josephus made this extensive statement about Jesus. Follow along with me. And there arose about this time Jesus, a wise man, if indeed we should call him a man, for he was a doer of marvelous deeds, a teacher of men who received the truth with pleasure. He led away many Jews and also Greeks. He was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross on his impeachment by the chief men among us, those who had loved him at first did not cease, for he appeared to them on the 3rd day alive again. The divine prophets having spoken these and thousands of other wonderful things about him, and even now the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not yet died out. A pretty powerful witness to the life of Jesus, but the skeptic says, hold on just a second. Was Josephus a Christian? And the answer to that is no. Well, how in the world would Josephus have written all these things about Christ, if indeed we should call him a man, a doer of marvelous deeds, the prophets having written these and other wonderful things about him? Those are things a Christian would put in. And the skeptic says those are Christian interpolations. The Christian inserted those into the text of Josephus. Josephus never would have said that. Let's look at that idea. How do they know they're Christian interpolations? Every manuscript that we have of Josephus has that section in it. So if you were just looking at the manuscripts, you couldn't say that it's a Christian interpolation because they've all got them in there. Well, the skeptics say, well, Josephus never would say that. Well, how do they know? Maybe Josephus was just recording what was commonly believed about Jesus at the time. Also, look at this. Suppose you take out all of the sections that supposedly are Christian interpolation. If indeed we should call him a man, a doer of marvelous deeds. He was the Christ. Take those out. You know what you still have? You still have historical documentation of the life of Jesus Christ. Josephus twice mentions Jesus. We call Josephus to the stand. Josephus, was there a man named Jesus in the 1st century? Yes. Did he have a brother named James? Yes. Were problems caused by him with the Jewish nation? Yes. Josephus testifies loudly to the life of Jesus. But now he is not the only witness that we can call besides the New Testament documents. There are other witnesses. I would like to call to the stand a man by the name of Tacitus. Tacitus wrote Roman history at the end of the 1st century and a little bit into the 2nd century. They're right around 100 AD. In his Roman history that he wrote about a man named Nero. Nero was one of the most vile individuals that I have ever read about. Nero allegedly had an incestuous relationship with his mother and then subsequently had her killed. Nero had married a 13-year-old boy and had a huge wedding ceremony. Nero was a vile creature. He is the one that people suggest martyred Peter and Paul from everything that we can tell. Nero was a villain in the realest sense of the word. But Nero decided he wanted to rebuild Rome. And so to rebuild Rome, he would have to destroy Rome. And he decided he would just set Rome on fire. And that's what he did. He sent his servants out and they torched several of the sections of Rome. I think he burned down over 50 or 75% of the entire city of Rome. And that was in about 64 AD. And the rumors started spreading that Nero had burned Rome. And Nero was catching quite a bit of flack for that. So he devised a way to blame this on the Christians. And he said those Christians are the ones who are really responsible for the burning of Rome. Now, the Romans were already skeptical of the Christians anyway. The Romans said that the Christians were atheists, which is ironic, but the Christians were against their gods, against theist gods. The Christians were against the Roman gods. Not only that, the Romans rumored that the Christians married their brothers, since they would call each other brother or sister so-and-so, because they were all brothers or sisters in Christ. So they said these Christians are incestuous. Not only that, they said the Christians are cannibals. The Christians meet on the first day of the week and they eat someone's flesh and drink someone's blood. They're cannibals. And so the Christians were an easy target, and Nero said the Christians had burned Rome and started persecuting the Christians. But I want you to read with me the section from Tacitus that describes this situation. Tacitus said this: Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians, as they were popularly called. Their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius' reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilatus. But in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly superstition had broken out afresh, not only in Judea, where the mischief had started, but even in Rome. Look at the approach that Tacitus takes to Christianity. He said it's a deadly superstition, that these people are notoriously depraved. Also look at how he documents the origination of Christianity from a very Roman standpoint. He says, in the reign of Tiberius, under Pontius Pilatus, there was a man, Christ, who was executed by Pilate. Exactly as you would expect a Roman historian to record the life of Christ. From a Roman standpoint, under the reign of Tiberius, Pontius Pilatus being the governor of Judea, who executed this person who was the originator of these notoriously depraved, mischievous Christians. And yet, Tacitus documents the life of Jesus. This is what you would call hostile testimony. He's not trying to help you believe in Jesus. He's not trying to help the Romans understand that Jesus was the Christ. He's saying, no, Jesus was the originator of this notoriously depraved band of mischievous Christians. And yet he does document the life of Jesus Christ. Tacitus is a powerful witness to the life of Jesus. Let's call another person to the stand, a man by the name of Lucian. Lucian was a skeptic in the highest sense of the word. He thought that Christians were ignorant. He thought they were gullible. He thought that they were not thinking individuals, that they were allowing themselves to be misled for a number of different reasons. And he wrote a book called The Death of Peregrine. And in that book, he describes in a very mocking, caustic sense what was going on in Christianity in his opinion. Read with me the text from Lucian. Lucian says this: the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. Do you see what Lucian says? These people worship a man. Wait just a second. Most people worship a god. Most people worship the sun god or the moon god or a half man, half wolf, or like the Egyptians, half man, half something else. They don't worship just a man many times. No, sometimes these Christians worship just a man. A man who was a crucified sage. An individual who lived on this earth. Now, of course, we well understand that that man was God in the flesh and he was so much more than a man. But Lucian recognized his humanity when he said the Christians worship a man. Is the life of Jesus Christ historically viable? Historically provable? I need you to understand this, and I need you to understand it very well. There is not a better documented historical life than the life of Jesus Christ. If you throw out the evidence for the life of Jesus, then you might as well throw out everything that anyone has ever known historically and throw your hands up in the air and admit that you can't know anything because the evidence for the life of Jesus is overwhelming. What year is it? It's the year 2007 A.D. Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. We date all time around the life of Jesus Christ. Is it true that there's not enough historical evidence to prove the life of Jesus? That is as false of a statement as there ever was. That which we have seen, John said, which we have looked upon, which our hands have handled concerning the word of life. Peter said, we do not follow cunningly devised fables, but were eyewitnesses of His majesty. Jesus Christ was a historical person.
There is a lot that could be said after that, though the point well stated. I'm thinking of transitioning into the next week's lesson already with the follow-up to this. A baby that was born in a Bethlehem stall. Life's most important question after that is, who is Jesus? Was He who He said that He is? Born in a Bethlehem stall, raised as a carpenter's son, only 3 years of a public ministry, and yet 2,000 years later, His name still divides history and commands allegiance. We only have a few options, and it's based off what He said of Himself. Jesus, many times in those well-documented historical accounts, claimed to be the Son or the nature of God in flesh. He said, I and my Father are one. To see me is to see the Father. To believe in me is to believe in God. To receive me is to receive Him who sent me. To honor me is to honor the Father. Time and time again. Most of those quotes come from John. But the New Testament does not whisper this claim. It declares it. In the beginning, John 1:1, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Those are not casual claims. If they are false, they are dangerous. And if they are true, they change everything. So what are our options? And this is just a summary in a devotional fashion, but these are the bare bones of this discussion. Option one is He was a legend. That's an option. We have to consider that momentarily. Some suggest He was nothing more than that religious myth, a symbolic figure to just express moral ideals. You've heard much of the evidence that argues against this. The problem with that idea is history itself. There's no serious historian willing to put their, if they're thinking through it, reputation and profession on the line if they were held to accountability, who believes or denies the idea that Jesus of Nazareth existed first in the first century Palestine. His life attested not only is in Scripture, which we esteem as inspired, but also in secular sources, which others esteem even more so, because those secular sources, those hostile witnesses, aren't claiming to support belief in Jesus, though they lend credibility to his identity. There is a variation to this theory, though. Some say that Jesus existed, but the claims to being divine were added centuries later. That's something that Kyle didn't need to address in his video, but we need to be aware of it. That sounds persuasive until, again, you look at the credibility of the evidence. There's no tampering with what documents exist. For example, though the Gospels were completed within the lifetime of Jesus' contemporaries, which means his eyewitnesses, if those claims were fabricated, there would then be documentation of the people who knew him rising up to crush those ideas and to counter them immediately. A modern-day parallel would be, imagine today if someone claiming that past presidents such as Nixon, Ford, or Carter, Reagan even, claimed to be divine. The people who are still here who knew him would rise up and say, no, that's not right. So the legend theory collapses under that simple degree of scrutiny. Well, we'll mark that one out. There's another idea. People just call him a liar, maybe without thinking through the implications of that. Perhaps Jesus knew he was the Son of God, but deceived people anyway? Well, look again at the hostile witnesses or the critics of Jesus. They admit, even in the text, that he was a towering moral figure, and his ethics shaped civilizations for the better in ways that no other historical figure has. A deliberate liar cannot be the greatest moral example in history. You cannot build, as quote someone said, the Sermon on the Mount on the top of fraud. And this was not a minor claim. His identity was central to everything he taught. It's because he is God in flesh and the claim of that everything else lends credibility and weight. So, take away his identity and I don't need to follow anything he says. If he lied about his identity, he disqualified himself from moral greatness, and he did not leave room to admire him as just a moral teacher. He never left room for that option. He forces the issue to accept him as he says he is. He either is or he's not. So a liar doesn't hold much water. There is a third option. Was he a lunatic? That sounds sacrilegious perhaps, or blasphemous. But it's an option we have to consider. Maybe he believed he was divine, but was sincerely deluded, deceived in his own mind. Well, some people have claimed to be more than they are, and we call those people what they are. But look at him, the depth of his teachings, the profundity of his precepts, the balance of his mind, the compassion in his actions, the courage in his suffering, the composure before his execution, and the excruciating pain of that very word that comes from the pain of the cross. Does all of this sound like insanity? We admire it as exceptional because none of us would face it with the same degree of resolve. The most influential life in human history, the moral compass of millions, and the calmest man in the face of crucifixion. Is he a lunatic? Not likely. If he was not a legend, if he was not a liar, if he was not deranged, there's one option that we are forced to consider carefully. Was he Lord? If he was, he is. But we don't accept that claim blindly. Let me look at the real time according to my phone. Okay. Claims require credentials. And I'm so thankful that we have John's documentation of Jesus' own statement. If you do not believe me, Jesus said, believe the works that you may believe. In other words, examine the evidence. I am so thankful. I was speaking earlier about how I love the book of John. It's written apologetically. Examine the evidence as we will. Next week, we begin looking at the question about the miracles of Jesus and the greatest core miracle of them all, the core doctrine of the resurrection. Not just a teaching, did it happen? Did it happen? So if Jesus is the Son of God, we would expect certain credentials, and we will examine those next week.